All right. So let's get started with talking about nudge. I want to give you a sense of the sorts of arguments that you can expect from them. I want to talk a little bit about the stock issues, which are the basic structural elements of the policy debate that you're going to, or the issue debate that you're going to be having in class. And then I also want to go through brief chapter summaries as I understand them. And that's the jumping off point to start talking through the presentations, because then you can either agree or disagree. You can, use whatever it is that I've put up here as a way of moving into your own presentations. Once I'm done with this lecture, I'll, like I said, I'll turn off the camera and then we'll just sit in a group and talk about the readings. So the first thing that you can expect from Thaler and Sunstein, and all of these come very much at the very beginning of the book, is that nudges, whatever those are supposed to be, nudges do not infringe on people's freedom of choice. And that's something that you can kind of argue against, because in some sense, what they're asking for is a non-interventionist way of persuading people, or a way of guiding people's choices without telling them exactly what to do. The idea, in some sense, is to put forward a set of strategically arranged choices and then make those choices such that the best available option for everyone is the one that is most likely to be selected. So without actually taking the definition of nudge directly from the book, a nudge is a way of influencing people, and according to them, without influencing their freedom of choice or infringing on their freedom of choice. He starts out with a couple of things, and this comes from the first presentation that Will is going to talk a little bit about. There is a false assumption and two misconceptions. And this is the thing that Thaler and Sunstein want to respond to in general, right? Like, why do we need nudges in general? First, because we typically assume that people will make choices that are in their best interest, but again and again, people prove us wrong. So nudges are necessary on the one hand because when people do exercise their own freedom of choice, they typically choose poorly. And that's just with having a random or like a non-structured arrangement of choices available to those folks. The first misconception is that it's possible to avoid influencing choices. So nudge is ethical in their point of view because it's not possible to avoid influencing people, but we need to be able to influence people without changing their mind for them, right? And then the second assumption, or the second misconception, is that their framework, which they're calling Libertarian Paternalism, always involves some form of coercion. This last point deserves some discussion too, because there are several points in the book where they bring up this philosophical and political point of view, which they call, Libertarian Paternalism, right? And it's, on the one hand, intended to be an oxymoron, and we can appreciate that much about that title, because on the one hand, the libertarian half of this title is meant to preserve this idea of freedom of choice, and paternalism is meant to signify this guiding people's choices on their behalf. So at the heart of the book, right, the thing that you can expect from this book, the clash or the conflict that's, I think, at the center of what they're doing here, is this paradox between, on the one hand, not being able to avoid influencing people's choices, always being in a position where you're doing something to make people act differently, and at one and the same time wanting to preserve people's freedom of choice. So a nudge is a solution to this, where it's supposed to be a way through the middle of this, where we're, on the one hand, getting people to do what we want, but on the other, making people make those choices for themselves in order to get them to do what we want. Okay. So in a nutshell, like, that's how I understand the major argument of this, of the book. The second thing that I want to draw your attention to, and I didn't finish this on the handout, which I should have, but Thaler and Sunstein make several distinctions. One of them is between econs and humans. Another one of them is between incentives and nudges. And those distinctions are very important to keep track of, okay? Does anyone off the top of their head have an idea of what the difference between an incentive and a nudge might be? Go ahead.
Well, I guess I remember that a nudge is kind of like you said, it's an influence, it's a push in a particular direction. And I remember they talked in the book about how when giving options, one nudge is like you give people three options: the good option, the bad option, and then a slightly modified, slightly worse version of the good option that makes the good option look like it stands much further above both the bad and the other option.
I see.
And that nudges you to pick the best option.
Why isn't that an incentive?
What an incentive would just be like a reward for picking the best option.
Okay. So nudges are what? More abstract? They involve more choices or a selection of different incentives?
And I guess more careful planning on the part of the nudger.
Okay. So incentives function as this reward and punishment system that are attached to specific choices that you make. And the nudges do something different. They arrange the choices that are available for you to guide the best possible choice. Those aren't the definitions that they give in the book, but for right now, I think that will work for us. Anything else that you guys want to say about incentives and nudges as different ideas? Okay, I'll leave the econ-human distinction for a little bit later. And then the last thing, and this is really their policy claim here, is that choice architects can make major improvements by designing use-friendly environments. So the next thing I want to talk to you about a little bit, and this is going to come as a little as a detour from the nudge text, is the stock issues. So when we've talked about speech structures before, I've talked about introductions, bodies, and conclusions, but I haven't really talked about how you're going to arrange your debate speeches. And for the issue debate in particular, I'm going to ask you to arrange it using the stock issues. Stock issues are basically different sections of the speech. Topicality would be something you would introduce in the introduction. Harms would be something that you would introduce in about main point 1. Inherent barriers, main point 1 or main point 2. Plan and counter, or just the plan, I suppose, would be main point 2 or 3. And then disadvantages would be reserved only for a negative position who is attacking a policy. I want to take you through a dressed-down version of what these terms mean, using like an oversimplified example that's related to one of the diagnostic speeches that was delivered in class. So first, the definitions of these things. Topicality. Topicality means, or is defined as the specific resolution or policy that you seek to advance that is either for or against the status quo. Status quo refers only to the present state of affairs. If you are an affirmative case, your topicality is going to argue that we should do something to change the status quo. If you're running a negative case, your argument is going to be that we should not pursue this affirmatives plan in order to maintain the status quo, because the status quo is better than any change that we could make to it. So topicality first is the thesis statement, or the heart of the argument that you're making. It is either the policy that you are advancing or the statement that defends the status quo, saying that it's better than any change that we could make. The second term is harms. Harms are the negative consequences, and this is strictly for the affirmative case, right? Harms are the negative consequences of preserving the status quo. So in other words, if we keep things the way that they are, what negative consequences will result? And it's for that reason that harms are typically divided into two pieces. And it's not listed here, but there's the harm and the impact. There's the harm, which is what is wrong with the current situation. And then there's the impact, or the consequence, the downstream effect. What is going to happen as a result that is so bad? The so what question for the harms.
If you were defending the status quo, wouldn't you still have a harm statement against, like, the slippery slope of, what might happen if we allow X, Y, Z?
The reason why that isn't a harm is because it's not attached specifically to the status quo, but it's attached to the affirmative plan. So in that case, and it's a slippery distinction, right? But if you are a negative attacking the affirmative, you're not going to address harms or new harms because you want the status quo to be as perfect as possible. If you are the negative attacking the affirmative, you're going to use disadvantages instead, which are reasons why the affirmative plan makes things worse and how it makes it worse. And that's at the very bottom of that list there. So we have topicality and harm so far. Topicality is the resolution, the thesis, the policy claim, or the claim in defense of the status quo. Harms are what is wrong with the status quo, and then the impact or the consequence of that harm. The third part, and the bolded components of the stock issues that I have listed here are the ones that I want to talk about in relationship to Sunstein and Thaler. Inherent barriers, the plan, and solvency. Inherent barriers are typically the most confusing part of the stock issues. Inherent barriers refer to those things for the affirmative that stand in the way of being able to solve the problem. Typically, there are three different ways that there are obstacles to a problem being solved. The first is structural, and a structural inherent barrier means that we don't have enough. There aren't enough resources, there isn't enough manpower, there isn't enough concrete, there isn't enough money, there isn't enough whatever. That's a structural inherency. Overcoming that problem or meeting that inherent barrier would mean making up the resource deficit that is currently in place. The second kind of inherency is attitudinal. Attitudinal inherency means that people are apathetic, or they just don't want to deal with the problem, or they are overtly hostile to it, and therefore don't want to have any part in it. And the final one is existential, which is we don't know what's standing in the way, but because it remains a problem, we know that there must be something standing in our way. In order from the easiest to overcome to the most difficult to overcome, structural is the easiest and existential typically is the most difficult. Because with existential inherency, you are conceding that you don't know what exactly stands in your way. The plan is simple. It's the series of steps that you will take in order to remedy the status quo. If you're a negative, you can also present a counter plan, which is an alternative, better plan than the one that the affirmative has presented. Solvency is the satisfaction step of Monroe's motivated sequence. Solvency describes the advantages produced by the plan or the net benefit of this policy that you're advancing. In particular, the reason why I have these bolded here are because these are the terms that are going to be stressed in Nudge. You're going to have to find them, and I'll ask about them as we're going through the book. But inherency, plan, and solvency are what Nudge is all about. First, they're going to identify what is stopping people from making responsible decisions, which is an inherent barrier, right? Next, they're going to say, we have a solution for it, and it's called what? A nudge. And then finally, the solvency, they're going to show how the nudges have either worked in previous situations or how they can work in current situations. Sound good? Stock issues are super important, which is why I'm going through them so slowly. This is the basic outline of the speeches that you'll deliver during the issue debate. So knowing what the stock issues are, knowing what they mean, and being able to separate them out is, like I said, very important. Let me give you a quick example of the stock issues in action, because I've talked to you in terms of definitions, but I haven't given you like a case study. Have I done the bicycle example in here yet? No? Okay. So you are biking down Hillsborough Street, trying to go to Freshie or Jimmy John's, whichever one you prefer, and you make a left-hand turn finally, because the lights take forever to turn, and you fall into a pothole with your bike. And your bike is destroyed at this point. So your front wheel is bent out of shape, and it's all because of this pothole. You almost got hit by a car, and you are convinced now that something needs to be done. So you find the relevant authorities in Raleigh, and you say to them, all right, I have a case for you for fixing the potholes on Hillsborough Street. Starting with topicality, what would the resolution be?
Potholes get filled out.
Sorry?
Potholes get filled out.
So as a policy resolution, you're right, except every policy resolution must have a should phrase or clause in it, right? So the city of Raleigh, we're going to identify someone to do the job, should fill the potholes. Easy enough, right? That's it. Next, harms. What are the harms and impacts of leaving the pothole as it is, of maintaining the status quo?
Damages to bike, damages to cars.
Okay, so I think all of those are harms, right? Like we're not quite at the impact, so damages to bikes, damages to people, you said, and then damages to vehicles. So what? That's their problem, you know? Like, you should have been looking more closely. So what's the impact of that? Why is the state going to care?
They don't want the people dying.
They have an interest in protecting the people, right? And what happens if they decide not to protect the people?
People might flee the area.
Okay, so you'll get flight from the North Carolina area because they're not maintaining their roads, which is, you know,
That's
just...
where like the states are calling them, so.
Sure. And then you also have liability suits, right? Like you have all sorts of problems. What is going to result if we maintain the status quo? If you leave that pothole in the road, it's not just that people's cars and so forth are being damaged, but that people will die, and the state has an interest in maintaining that people will live, and that people will file suits. Exactly, right? Like they're going to, and the pothole itself needs to be fixed for all of these reasons, right? So inherent barriers. What's stopping us from fixing the pothole? Let's try and come up with attitudinal, structural, and existential reasons why it might not be fixed.
The city is bankrupt.
City is bankrupt, lack of resources, structural inherency. Into that category, you could also throw lack of workers, lack of concrete, lack of whatever. Yeah.
I don't know if it goes into it, but shop owners might complain because it might affect their business.
So that would be an attitudinal inherency, right? People who are predisposed to have a negative opinion about it, if you're going to shut down the road in front of Jimmy John's and Freshie, I'm sure that Jimmy John's and Freshie is going to have something to say about it, right? So you're going to have a hostile audience there saying that, look, the road might be important, but my business is more important. All right, existential. This one's tricky. The best example I could find, right, is that we don't know what's causing the pothole. In fact, we've come back to the pothole year after year and tried to fill it over again and again, and it has not worked. So the best thing that we can do is do an exploratory study to see whether there's a sinkhole sitting underneath Hillsborough Street and whether or not that's ultimately responsible for this problem. Existential inherency says that we don't know what's causing the problem, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something to try and fix it anyway. So harms, inherency, topicality, everyone good? All right, plan. What's the plan? This is really simple.
Are we using the same
Just set up
example?
a time where you think there's going to be the least amount of traffic to shut down the road and fix the problem.
Okay, but state is bankrupt.
Fund, or like come up with more resources, sources to
Okay.
like fundraising.
Sure, okay, so magical money raising, and we'll, you know, like...
Fundraising's not magical.
Okay, no, you're right, you're absolutely right.
Maybe not enough to fix a pothole, but...
The point I'm trying to make is that whatever your plan is going to be, it has to overcome whatever inherent obstacles that you've presented at this point. So, like, if all of those obstacles were there, you would say that some of the money that we would raise would go to the owners of Freshie and Jimmy John's. We would raise enough money to fix the pothole permanently, and if we didn't know, we would also do that sinkhole study just to make sure, right? And that way we're covering all of our bases in the plan itself. But you're right, you're 100%, and fundraising is not magical. All right. Solvency. Solvency amounts to the reversal of the harms and the overcoming of the inherent barriers, showing us what happens once we implement this plan. And in a number of cases, right, this is what Thaler and Sunstein do such a good job of. They show us how nudges have worked in previous situations and how they can work again for us. That doesn't come down to a political perspective so much as it comes down to behavioral economics and looking at how other people have conducted behavioral studies in the past that show how people will act in the future. Okay. I'm not going to talk about disadvantages, but everyone good with stock issues? Like, that's my major objective today. That's what I want to make sure that you get. In addition to knowing that this interfaces back with nudge, because Thaler and Sunstein are going to talk over and over again about what prevents people from making good choices, how they can make better choices, and what sorts of structures we need in order to make those choices possible. I'm going to leave these undiscussed, the different summaries of the chapters, but let's say, let me talk about a couple of them just in relationship to the reading, or to the stock issues, and then we'll move forward. So biases and blunders, this is the first chapter. Humans are overly optimistic, hate to lose, tend to stick to the default option, and make their choices based on the way that problems are stated. What does that sound like to you? Inherency, plan, or solvency? Inherency. All right. When it comes to what we want, we often say what we would prefer one thing to another, but then later choose the opposite. Inherency, plan, or solvency? Inherency. Humans will generally act based on what they believe others are also doing. Is that also plan?
It could be both.
I think it is both for them, right? Because they want to motivate social action by showing that X number of people also think this way, and that way they'll get other people on board to do something that would otherwise be unpopular. Humans need nudges when they cannot see the immediate benefits of their policies, when they think that it will take too much energy to make a change, when they know they are uncertain of how often they need to act, and when they don't know what effect their choices have. Plan. And then building good choice architecture to give human nudges requires that we create good defaults, reasonable incentives, provide feedback, anticipate mistakes, and to leave open a wide range of choices. Plan. Everyone follow? Everyone on the same page? Great. So let's turn desks toward the middle of the classroom, and then we'll start with Will on biases and blunders. Sorry?
Where do I go?
Just turn around. You don't need to stand up for it.